To understand the birth of civilizations, we need to go back about 12,000 years in time, when our ancestors made a decision that would forever change humanity's destiny, abandoning nomadic life and beginning to plant their own food. For thousands of years, human groups lived as hunter-gatherers, following animal herds and collecting seasonal fruits. They were small groups, rarely exceeding 150 people, who moved constantly in search of resources. But at the end of the last ice age, something extraordinary happened in different parts of the world, almost simultaneously. In the Fertile Crescent, a region that today encompasses parts of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Turkey, people began domesticating wheat and barley. In the Indus Valley, they cultivated rice and lentils. In China, they developed techniques for growing rice and corn. In the Americas, indigenous communities domesticated corn, beans, and squash. This revolution, which historians call the Neolithic Revolution, didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that lasted thousands of years. Agriculture changed everything. For the first time in history, a small group of people could produce enough food to sustain larger groups. This created something unprecedented: free time. Not everyone needed to be directly involved in food production anymore. Some people could specialize in other activities, making tools, weaving textiles, building more elaborate houses, or developing trade systems. With stability came population growth. Villages that once housed a few dozen inhabitants began to shelter hundreds, then thousands of people. And with more people living closely together, the need for more complex social organization arose. Someone needed to coordinate planting, manage grain stores, and resolve conflicts between neighbors. This is where the first true cities are born. Jericho, in the Jordan Valley, is considered one of the oldest, dating from about 9000 BC. Çatalhöyük, in Turkey, impresses with its 8,000 inhabitants in 6500 BC. But it's in Mesopotamia that we see the emergence of the first true city-states: Ur, Uruk, and Eridu. Uruk deserves special mention. Around 3500 BC, it was probably the largest city in the world, with about 50,000 inhabitants. It was there that they developed cuneiform writing, humanity's first written records. Imagine the revolution this represented. For the first time, knowledge could be preserved and transmitted accurately across generations. Simultaneously, in Egypt, communities along the Nile developed their own innovations. The predictability of the river's floods allowed for planned and surprisingly productive agriculture. Around 3100 BC, Pharaoh Menes unified Upper and Lower Egypt, creating history's first great centralized state. In the Indus Valley, the Harappa civilization flourished with planned cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. These cities had sophisticated sewage systems, streets organized in grids, and an impressive level of architectural standardization, something that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. In China, along the Yellow River, the first agricultural communities that would later give rise to Chinese dynasties were emerging. And in the Americas, the Olmecs were establishing the foundations of what would become one of the world's richest regions in ancient civilizations. What did these first civilizations have in common? First, they all developed near great rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile in Egypt, the Indus in the Indian subcontinent, the Yellow in China. These rivers provided water for irrigation, fertile soil from annual floods, and transportation routes. Second, They all developed writing systems. Third, they created hierarchical social structures with political and religious leaders at the top. Fourth, they built impressive monuments, ziggurats in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Egypt, great public baths in the Indus Valley. But perhaps most impressive is that these civilizations didn't arise in isolation. Even separated by thousands of kilometers, they developed similar solutions to similar problems. This shows us something fundamental about human nature. Given favorable conditions, our species has a natural tendency to create complex societies, art, writing, and monuments that challenge time. These first civilizations established the foundations of everything that would come after. The idea of the state, writing, law, organized religion, monumental art, and long-distance trade. They were the embryo of all the great civilizations that would dominate the world in the millennia to follow. With the foundations established, these first civilizations began to expand their reach and influence. The next 1,000 years would see the emergence of true empires, sophisticated legal systems, and cultural exchanges that would connect entire continents. Humanity was about to enter its first era of global expansion. Between 3000 and 1000 BC, human civilizations experienced their first great period of expansion and consolidation. What had begun as isolated city-states evolved into great empires that dominated entire regions, establishing patterns of government, law, and culture that would influence humanity for millennia. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire, established by Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BC, became history's first true empire. Sargon wasn't content to rule a single city. He conquered the entire region between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean, creating a model of imperial expansion that would be copied by all subsequent conquerors. His empire lasted more than 200 years and established the idea that a powerful leader could unify different peoples under a single administration. Even more impressive was the Code of Hammurabi, created by the Babylonian king around 1750 BC. This wasn't just the first written code of laws. It was a revolutionary document that established the concept of standardized justice. The famous 282 laws covered everything from commercial contracts to women's rights and punishments for crimes. The idea that law should be the same for everyone, regardless of social status, was completely new. Imagine the impact. For the first time in history, a common merchant could know exactly what his rights and duties were. In Egypt, this period marks the consolidation of pharaonic power and the construction of antiquity's most impressive monuments. The Old Kingdom, 2686 to 181 BC, saw the construction of the Giza pyramids, projects that required not only advanced engineering knowledge but also impressive administrative organization. It's estimated that the Great Pyramid of Khufu employed 20,000 workers for more than 20 years. This tells us something fundamental about Egyptian society. It had developed educational, administrative, and logistical systems sophisticated enough to coordinate projects of unprecedented scale. Daily life in Egypt during this period reveals a surprisingly advanced society. Discovered papyri show that Egyptians had surprisingly effective medical systems, knew complex surgical techniques, and kept detailed treatment records. They developed a 365-day calendar, created mummification techniques that preserved bodies for thousands of years, and established a trade network extending to Nubia, from where they brought gold, and to the Levant, from where they imported cedar, wood. Meanwhile, in the Indus Valley, the Harappa civilization reached its peak. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro housed up to 40,000 inhabitants each, with sewage and running water systems that wouldn't be surpassed until the modern era. What's most impressive about the Harappans is their level of standardization. Bricks of the same dimensions were used in cities separated by hundreds of kilometers, suggesting an extremely organized central government. In China, the Shang dynasty, 1600 to 1046 BC, established many of the patterns that would define Chinese civilization. For the next 3,000 years, they developed Chinese writing, still used today in evolved form, created advanced bronze working techniques, and established the concept of the mandate of heaven, the idea that the emperor ruled by divine right. The Shang dynasty also left us the first Chinese written records engraved on oracle bones, which reveal a complex society with elaborate rituals, well-defined social hierarchies, and a sophisticated belief system. This period also marks the beginning of organized long-distance trade. Mesopotamian merchants established trade networks extending from India to Anatolia. The tin needed to make bronze came from places as distant as the British Isles. This meant that by 2000 BC, there already existed a primitive global economy connecting civilizations on different continents. The invention of the wheel, which occurred in Mesopotamia around 3500 BC, revolutionized both transportation and warfare. Ox-drawn carts allowed the transport of heavy loads over long distances, while horse-drawn war chariots completely changed military tactics. The Hittites in Anatolia were the first to completely master this technology, creating an empire that rivaled Egypt in power and influence. Speaking of military technology, this period also saw the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Iron was harder to work than bronze, but produced superior weapons and tools. The first to master this technology gained decisive military advantages. The Sea Peoples, mysterious groups that attacked the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC, may have used iron weapons to defeat bronze-armed armies. Religion also consolidated during this period. In Egypt, the cult of Ra became the state religion. In Mesopotamia, each city-state had its patron god, but all recognized a common pantheon. In China, ancestor worship became fundamental to social organization. These religions weren't just belief systems, they were social structures that legitimized political power and created community cohesion. The period also saw the development of literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia is considered humanity's first literary work. It tells the story of a king seeking immortality, exploring universal themes that still touch us today: friendship, mortality, the search for meaning. It's impressive to realize that stories written 4,000 years ago can still move us. This period of formation and consolidation established patterns that would last millennia. The idea of empire, codified legal systems, centralized administration, international trade, literature, and monumental art. More importantly, it established the idea that different peoples could be united under a single authority while maintaining their distinct cultural identities. With civilization's basic structures established, humanity was ready for its first great period of splendor. The coming centuries would see the emergence of empires that would dominate entire continents, philosophies that would influence human thought forever, and artistic and architectural achievements that still amaze us today. If there's a period in ancient history that can be called humanity's golden age, it's the period from approximately 800 BC to 500 AD. These 2,300 years saw the emergence of empires that dominated entire continents, the birth of the great world religions, extraordinary scientific and philosophical advances, and artistic achievements that continue to inspire us today. Let's begin with classical Greece, which between 500 and 300 BC produced an intellectual explosion unprecedented in human history. In Athens, democracy, a word that literally means rule by the people, was experimented with for the first time. Of course, it was a limited democracy, restricted to free men. But the idea that political power should come from the people was revolutionary. But it was the Greek philosophers who truly changed how we think about the world. Socrates developed the Socratic method of questioning, which is still the basis of critical thinking today. His disciple Plato created the Academy, the world's first university, and wrote dialogues that explore fundamental questions about justice, truth, and reality. Aristotle, Plato's disciple, systematized practically every field of human knowledge: logic, ethics, politics, biology, physics. His works were used in European universities until the 17th century. Daily life in 5th century BC Athens was extraordinarily, intellectually rich. Common citizens attended the theatre to watch tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, plays that are still performed and studied today. In the gymnasium, young people not only exercised their bodies, but debated philosophy and mathematics. The agora was not just a market, but a center of political discussion where any citizen could express their opinions. While the Greeks revolutionized thought on the other side of the world, China was living its own golden age during the Han Dynasty, 206 BC, 220 AD. This dynasty consolidated many of the characteristics that would define Chinese civilization for the next 2,000 years. It was during the Han that the Silk Road was established, connecting China to the Mediterranean through a 6,400-kilometer trade network. Han administration was impressive in its sophistication. The central government controlled a territory larger than the Roman Empire through a system of civil servants selected by merit-based examinations. History's first meritocratic civil service. The Han Dynasty also standardized writing, currency, and even road width throughout the empire. But it's in India that we see perhaps the most significant development of this period, the birth of Buddhism. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, lived around 500 BC and developed a philosophy that would become one of the great world religions. Buddhism offered something new, a religion based on universal compassion, which promised liberation from suffering through personal enlightenment, not through rituals or sacrifices. During Emperor Ashoka's reign, 268 to 232 BC, Buddhism spread throughout Asia. Ashoka, after a particularly bloody war, converted to Buddhism and promoted its principles of non-violence and compassion. His edicts, carved in stone throughout his empire, are some of history's first human rights documents, promoting religious tolerance and care for the poor. But perhaps the most impressive empire of this period was Rome. What began as an Italian city-state became, in the following centuries, the largest empire the world had ever seen. At its peak, Rome controlled from Scotland to Sudan, from Portugal to Iraq, approximately 5 million square kilometers housing about 65 million people. What made Rome special wasn't just its size, but its capacity to integrate diverse peoples. The Romans had a unique talent for absorbing the best characteristics of the cultures they conquered. They adopted Greek philosophy, Etruscan architecture, Oriental engineering techniques, and integrated them into a distinctly Roman synthesis. Roman Engineering was particularly impressive. They built more than 400,000 kilometers of paved roads, many of which still exist today. Their aqueducts transported clean water for hundreds of kilometers, allowing cities like Rome to house more than 1 million inhabitants, something that wouldn't be seen again until the 19th century. Urban life in the Roman Empire was surprisingly modern. Rome had multi-story apartments, specialized shops, restaurants, public baths with hot and cold water, and even a postal system that functioned throughout the empire. A merchant in London could send a letter to Alexandria and be sure it would arrive in a few weeks. Roman law, codified in the Corpus Juris Civilis, established legal principles that are still fundamental in Western legal systems today. Presumption of innocence, right to defense, proportionality of punishments, the idea that all are equal before the law, regardless of social origin, was revolutionary. Parallel to Rome's growth, the world was being transformed by the birth of Christianity. Jesus of Nazareth lived during Augustus's reign, and his message of universal love and salvation through faith spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire. The Apostle Paul, through his missionary journeys, established Christian communities from Antioch to Rome. Christianity offered something that few religions of the time offered: hope for the poor and oppressed. Its message that all are children of God, regardless of social status, attracted millions of followers. When Emperor Constantine converted in 312 AD, Christianity began its transformation from persecuted religion to the dominant religion of the West. In Persia, the Sassanid Empire, 224–651 AD, created an impressive synthesis between Eastern and Western cultures. Ctesiphon, its capital, rivaled Rome in magnificence. The Sassanid Persians were great patrons of arts and sciences, preserving much Greek knowledge that would later be rediscovered in the West. This period also saw extraordinary scientific advances. In Alexandria, Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference with impressive accuracy. Hypatia became one of history's first female mathematicians. Ptolemy created a model of the universe that lasted 1,400 years. In China, they invented paper, gunpowder, and the compass, technologies that would revolutionize the world. The art of this period reached extraordinary heights. Greek sculptures of the classical period established beauty standards that still influence artists today. The Roman Pantheon, with its impossible dome, demonstrated architectural advances that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries. Pompeii's frescoes show us a society that valued beauty and refinement. But perhaps most impressive is that, despite the distances and communication difficulties of the time, these civilizations maintained contact with each other. Chinese silk was sold in Rome. Indian spices reached European tables. Buddhist philosophies influenced Greek thinkers. For the first time in history, there truly existed a world civilization. This period of splendor established many of the foundations of human civilization, democracy, systematic philosophy, experimental science, great world religions, codified law, and monumental art. More importantly, it demonstrated that humanity was capable of creating complex, tolerant, and prosperous societies that value both material achievement and spiritual and intellectual development. But even the most glorious periods in human history face challenges. From the 5th century AD, a series of profound transformations, barbarian invasions, climate changes, the emergence of new religions and technologies, began to fundamentally reshape the ancient world, ushering in a new era of changes and adaptations. The centuries between 400 and 1400 AD represent one of the most transformative periods in human history. This wasn't simply a period of decline, as it's often portrayed, but an era of profound changes that completely redefined the world's political, religious, and cultural map. The most dramatic transformation began with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. This didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of more than 2 centuries, during which peoples the Romans called barbarians gradually established themselves within imperial borders. Visigoths in Spain, Ostrogoths in Italy, Franks in Gaul, Vandals in North Africa. All these groups weren't simply destructive invaders, but people seeking land and better living conditions. What emerged from the Roman Empire's ruins was something completely new, a synthesis between Roman culture, Christianity, and Germanic traditions. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800 AD, tried to revive the Roman Empire, but created something different: the Holy Roman Empire, which combined political power and religious authority in ways Rome had never imagined. Daily life changed drastically during this period. The great Roman cities, some with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, shrank to small communities of a few thousand. Long-distance trade diminished, and many regions became economically self-sufficient. The feudal system emerged, where land was the basis of political and economic power, and where personal bonds of loyalty replaced Roman bureaucratic structures. But while Western Europe underwent these transformations, other parts of the world experienced extraordinary expansions. The rise of Islam in the 7th century was one of the most significant changes in world history. Muhammad, born in Mecca around 570 AD, received what Muslims believe were divine revelations that formed the Quran. His message of strict monotheism, social justice, and submission to Allah spread rapidly throughout the Arabian Peninsula. After Muhammad's death in 632 AD, his successors, the caliphs, launched a series of conquests that created, in less than 100 years, an empire extending from Spain to India. This wasn't just military expansion. It was an extraordinary cultural transformation. Peoples of completely different languages, cultures, and religions were united under Islam's banner. The medieval Islamic world became the center of world civilization. Baghdad, founded in 762 AD, became a city of more than 1 million inhabitants, a center of learning and trade. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad preserved and translated Greek, Persian, and Indian works, many of which would have been lost forever. Muslim scholars like Al-Kindi, Al-Razi, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna made fundamental advances in mathematics, medicine, chemistry, and philosophy. Intellectual life in the Islamic world was extraordinarily rich. In Córdoba, in Muslim Spain, Christians, Jews, and Muslims worked side by side, translating and commenting on ancient texts. This cultural synthesis produced some of the Middle Ages' greatest thinkers, such as Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Maimonides. The relative religious tolerance in the Islamic world contrasted with growing intolerance in Christian Europe. Simultaneously, China underwent its own transformations. The Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 AD, marked another golden period of Chinese civilization. Chang'an, the Tang capital, was probably the world's largest city with more than 1 million inhabitants. The Silk Road reached its peak during this period, bringing not just goods, but also religious and philosophical ideas to China. It was during the Tang dynasty that Buddhism reached its greatest development in China. before being gradually replaced by a synthesis of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism that would become characteristic of Chinese culture. Tang poetry, especially the works of Li Bai and Du Fu, is still considered the pinnacle of Chinese literature. Europe during this period wasn't stagnant as often thought. The monastic system preserved much classical knowledge, and monasteries like St. Gall became centers of learning. The Carolingian Renaissance, under Charlemagne, attempted to revive classical education. Universities began emerging in the 11th and 12th centuries, first in Bologna and Paris, then spreading throughout Europe. The Crusades, 1095-1291, represented a crucial moment of contact between the Christian and Islamic worlds. Although often portrayed as purely religious, the Crusades had profound economic and cultural consequences. They reopened Mediterranean trade, introduced Europeans to Asian products and Islamic knowledge, and helped finance the growth of commercial cities like Venice and Genoa. This period also saw the emergence of technological innovations that changed the world. Gutenberg's invention of the printing press around 1440 revolutionized knowledge dissemination. For the first time in history, books could be mass-produced, making knowledge accessible to a much larger number of people. In China, innovations like gunpowder, the compass, and paper gradually spread to the West, transforming both warfare and navigation. Gunpowder revolutionized military tactics, making medieval fortifications obsolete and changing the balance of military power. The compass enabled precise oceanic navigation, paving the way for the age of great discoveries. Changes weren't just technological, but also social and economic. The commercial renaissance of the 11th and 12th centuries saw the resurgence of European cities. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Bruges became centers of international trade, developing sophisticated banking and financial systems. Banking families, like the Medici of Florence, accumulated wealth that rivaled that of kings. This transformation period was also marked by extraordinary challenges. The Black Death, 1347-1351, killed between a third and half of Europe's population, causing profound social changes. The resulting labor shortage strengthened the position of surviving peasants, accelerating feudalism's decline. By the end of this period, around 1400, the world was fundamentally different from what it had been in 400 AD. New centers of power had emerged, new religions and philosophies shaped human thought, and new technologies were about to make true globalization possible. Humanity was on the threshold of its next great transformation. The transformations of previous centuries prepared the ground for even more dramatic changes. From the 15th century, a series of developments, from the Great Navigations to the Renaissance, from the Protestant Reformation to the Scientific Revolution, would begin to create the modern world we know today. The 15th to 18th centuries didn't represent a decline of human civilizations, but rather an extraordinary evolution that radically transformed how we live, think, and organize ourselves as a society. This period, from the Renaissance to the Industrial Revolution, established the foundations of the modern world. The Renaissance, beginning in 14th century Italy, represented a conscious rediscovery of classical culture, but also something much more significant: the birth of humanism. Thinkers like Francesco Petrarca and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola placed human beings at the center of philosophical reflection, celebrating human potential for creation, learning, and world transformation. Renaissance intellectual life was extraordinary. Leonardo da Vinci personified the ideal of the Renaissance man: artist, inventor, scientist, engineer, his notebooks reveal a mind that saw connections between art and science, between nature observation and technological creation. Michelangelo transformed marble blocks into figures that seemed to breathe. Raphael created paintings of technical perfection and beauty that still move us today. But the Renaissance wasn't just about art. It was a scientific revolution. Nicholas Copernicus proposed that Earth revolved around the sun, not the reverse, challenging centuries of religious dogma. Galileo Galilei used the telescope to observe Jupiter's moons, proving that not all celestial bodies revolved around Earth. Johannes Kepler discovered that planetary orbits were elliptical, not circular. Simultaneously, the age of exploration dramatically expanded the known world. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, permanently linking the eastern and western hemispheres for the first time. Vasco da Gama rounded Africa and reached India in 1498, establishing a direct maritime route between Europe and Asia. Ferdinand Magellan began the first circumnavigation of the globe, definitively proving Earth was round. These discoveries had extraordinary consequences. The Columbian Exchange, the exchange of plants, animals, diseases, and cultures between the Old and New worlds, fundamentally transformed both hemispheres. American crops like potatoes, corn, and tomatoes revolutionized European agriculture, while horses, cattle, and wheat transformed the Americas. Unfortunately, this exchange also included diseases. Smallpox, measles, and other European diseases devastated American indigenous populations who had no natural immunity. It's estimated that 90% of the America's indigenous population died in the first 150 years after European contact, one of history's greatest demographic catastrophes. European colonization of the Americas created the first truly global economic system. Silver extracted from Potosí mines in present-day Bolivia financed the Spanish Empire and circulated worldwide, reaching China through Manila trade. Sugar produced by African slaves in Brazil and the Caribbean fed Europe. This global system was built on the forced labor of millions of enslaved Africans, a moral stain that would define centuries of racial relations. Concurrently, the Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther in 1517, fragmented European religious unity. Luther questioned papal authority and asserted that salvation came through individual faith, not through the Catholic Church. This idea of individual responsibility revolutionized not just religion, but also politics and economics. The Reformation had unforeseen consequences. By promoting literacy, so everyone could read the Bible, it inadvertently stimulated mass education. By questioning traditional authority, it opened the way for questioning in other areas. The religious wars that followed, culminating in the 30 Years' War, 1618-1648, devastated Europe, but also led to the development of modern concepts of state sovereignty and religious tolerance. The 17th century saw the culmination of the scientific revolution. Isaac Newton published the Principia Mathematica in 1687, establishing laws of physics that explained both the movement of objects on Earth and planetary motion. Francis Bacon developed the modern scientific method based on empirical observation and experimentation. René Descartes established philosophical foundations for rational thought. This scientific revolution fundamentally changed how we see our place in the universe. We were no longer the center of creation, but part of a cosmos governed by comprehensible natural laws. This opened the way for the 18th century Enlightenment, which applied scientific reason to social and political problems. The Enlightenment produced some of history's most influential ideas. John Locke argued that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, not from divine right. Voltaire defended freedom of expression and religion. Adam Smith explained how free markets could generate prosperity. Immanuel Kant defined the Enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. These ideas had revolutionary consequences, literally. The American Revolution, 1776, was the first example of a people putting Enlightenment ideals into practice, creating a government based on popular consent and individual rights. The French Revolution, 1789, took these ideas even further, proclaiming the rights of man and citizen and attempting to reconstruct society based on reason. But perhaps the most fundamental transformation of this period was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 18th century England. James Watt's invention of the steam engine in 1769 marked the beginning of a new era. For the first time in human history, we had an energy source that didn't depend on human or animal muscles, wind or water. The Industrial Revolution transformed not just how we produce things, but how we live. People moved from countryside to cities in unprecedented numbers. New social classes emerged, the industrial bourgeoisie and urban proletariat. The pace of life accelerated dramatically. Changes that once took centuries now happened in decades. This period of decline or evolution was clearly an extraordinary evolution. It established many foundations of the modern world: the scientific method, representative democracy, human rights, industrial capitalism, and the idea of progress through reason and technology. It also created many problems we still face: extreme social inequality, environmental degradation, and tensions between tradition and modernity. The transformations of previous centuries set the stage for the modern era. From the 19th to 21st centuries, humanity would experience even more dramatic and rapid changes, creating the interconnected and technologically advanced world we live in today. We have reached the end of our epic journey through the history of human civilizations, and it's time to reflect on how this extraordinary 12,000-year trajectory has shaped the world we live in today. The legacy of ancient civilizations is not just relics in museums. They are living forces that continue to influence our politics, our culture, our technology, and our way of thinking. Let's begin with the political legacy. Athenian democracy, despite its limitations, established a principle that resonates through the centuries: the idea that people should have a voice in government. Today, more than half of the world's population lives under some form of democracy. When we protest for our rights, when we vote in elections, when we debate public policies, we are participating in a tradition that dates back to the Agora of Athens. Roman law continues to be the foundation of legal systems in dozens of countries. Concepts such as presumption of innocence, habeas corpus, and due process, fundamental to modern justice, were developed by Roman jurists more than 2,000 years ago. When a judge today weighs evidence or a lawyer defends a client, they are using principles established in the Roman Forum. Our architecture still reflects ancient influences. The US Capitol has Greek columns. Banks and courts around the world use Roman architectural elements to convey authority and permanence. Even modern buildings frequently incorporate proportions and aesthetic principles developed in classical antiquity. The great religions born in antiquity, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Judaism still shape the lives of billions of people. They influence not only individual spirituality, but also politics, art, morality, and social organization on a global scale. The values of compassion, justice, and human dignity, central to these traditions, continue to be fundamental to modern human rights movements. Philosophically, we still debate questions raised by the ancient Greeks. Plato asked, "What is justice?" Aristotle questioned, "How should we live?" Confucius explored, "How do we create a harmonious society?" These fundamental questions about ethics, politics, and meaning continue to be central to modern philosophy, psychology, and social sciences. Modern science is directly descended from the scientific revolution initiated in the Renaissance, which in turn was based on texts preserved and developed in the medieval Islamic world, which had preserved and expanded ancient Greek knowledge. When a scientist today formulates a hypothesis and tests it experimentally, they are using a method that traces back to Francis Bacon and, before him, to Islamic scholars like Al-Hazen. Technologically, we live in a world that would have seemed magical to our ancestors, but many fundamental innovations are refinements of ancient discoveries. Gutenberg's printing press evolved into the internet. Both revolutionized how we share information. Chinese gunpowder led not only to modern weapons, but also to the rockets that took us to space. Mathematics developed in ancient Babylon, and India is fundamental to computer programming. Economically, we live in a globalized world that has its roots in ancient trade networks. The Silk Road connected China and Europe 2,000 years ago. Medieval Islamic trade routes linked Africa, Asia, and Europe. When we buy a product made in China or invest in global markets, we participate in a tradition of international commerce that dates back to antiquity. Culturally, we are still influenced by works created millennia ago. Homer, Sophocles, and Virgil are still read and adapted. Greek architecture, Roman sculpture, and Chinese calligraphy continue to inspire artists. Modern musicians still use scales developed in ancient Greece. Cinema and literature frequently revisit ancient myths and stories, showing their continued relevance. But perhaps the most important legacy is the idea of human progress through knowledge and cooperation. Ancient civilizations showed us that people from different backgrounds can work together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. They showed us that knowledge can be preserved, transmitted, and expanded across generations. They showed us that humanity has the capacity to create beauty, seek truth, and fight for justice. Today, we face challenges our ancestors could not imagine. Climate change, artificial intelligence, global pandemics, nuclear weapons. But we also have resources they didn't have. Accumulated scientific knowledge, instant communication technologies, international organizations, and a historical understanding of how civilizations faced crises in the past. The history of human civilizations teaches us that we are an extraordinarily adaptable and creative species. We overcame ice ages, invented agriculture, built cities, created art that transcends time, developed philosophies that guide our lives, and technologies that expand our capabilities. More importantly, it reminds us that we are all part of a single human story. No matter our ethnic, national, or religious origin, we all descend from the same small groups that left Africa tens of thousands of years ago. All our civilizations built upon discoveries and innovations of previous civilizations. We are connected, not only by the challenges we face today, but by the extraordinary journey that brought us here. And so we reach the end of this epic journey through the complete history of human civilizations. I hope you have realized how extraordinary our species is, not just for our individual achievements, but for our capacity to learn, adapt, and build upon the work of previous generations. If this video sparked your curiosity about any specific period, leave it in the comments. I can make more detailed videos about specific eras or civilizations. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate notifications. And remember, you are part of this continuing story of humanity.